Welcome back to another episode of the Empower Grief Journey podcast. I'm your host, Chris Mamoni, and I'm an acceptance coach who helps people heal from grief, loss, and trauma to discover their self acceptance and step into their personal power. This podcast is your dedicated space for healing, growth, and transformation. Each episode shares insightful and inspirational stories, along with practical tools and actionable insights that can help guide you along your healing journey. Today, I have a phenomenal guest with us. His name is Steve Mann. He's a global entrepreneur, philanthropist, and a mentor who has lived worldwide from Africa to Southeast Asia. He is passionate about freedom, equality, and storytelling as a tool for connection. He has recently released his first book, Stories That Shape Us, a guide to passing down wisdom, joy, and love to the next generations. It is through his storytelling abilities that Steve aspires to empower generations to connect on a deeper level and create their own legacies through storytelling. So without further ado, I'd love to introduce you guys to Steve Mann. Steve, welcome to the podcast.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me, Chris.
Yeah, and I'm really excited to be recording with you today because in our podcast pre-interview, you shared an absolute journey of a life you've had from start to finish. And I don't want to ruin it for listeners, but I'm really excited for you to share more about that story with me today on the podcast and talk a little bit about that journey with grief as well as you went along in your travels.
Well, I've been a very, very fortunate man. I grew up on a potato farm in Idaho. Great parents. The kind of values that came back in the 50s and 60s, and went on to college. Got a terrific education with a master's in organization behavior. Started a few companies, and with some of those, I started traveling the country. I think we hit about 48 states doing that, and then traveling around the world, where eventually I ended up in about 55 countries. And we had sold that company, and I had started spending most of my time doing humanitarian work. And at one point, I was home from Africa, and the church was trying to recruit people to be senior missionaries. And I turned to my wife and said, can't do that with 6 dependent children, but who cares? Want to go to Zimbabwe and see if we can make a difference with AIDS? And she looked at me and says, absolutely, let's go. And 5 months later, we had sold everything, and we were living in Zimbabwe with all 6 children, running around trying to figure out where we could make the biggest difference and trying to do something with the AIDS pandemic. And I spent about 30 years doing humanitarian work, a lot in Africa, quite a bit in the Philippines, and now live in St. George, Utah. And my latest kind of adventure has been to write this book.
That's incredible, Steve. And I remember you sharing with me that as you went on these travels across the world, particularly in Africa, I remember our conversations that the culture and the quality of life in those countries was radically different from the United States.
When we moved to Zimbabwe, 38% of all adults were HIV positive. That meant then that they were dead within 5 years. There were no antiretrovirals, there was no treatment, there was no cures. The country was also running about 1,000% a month inflation. And
Wow.
they had destroyed the farms. And so things could be pretty bleak. And it was a very different experience for my family seeing that. And, one kind of event that really struck out to me is some years later, the family had moved back to Idaho, and I was commuting 6 months or 6 weeks in Idaho, 6 weeks in Zimbabwe, back and forth because I was still running the programs. It's a long commute, by the way.
Yeah,
And
just a little.
just a little. What really struck me about that, though, was I would be in Zimbabwe with all these kind of problems, and I'd go out on the streets in the morning and start just walking with people. They were walking to work or wherever they were going. And generally they were cheerful. They were happy. They were looking forward. They were looking to the next thing. And there was just this underwriting optimism in spite of all the tragedy going on. I would then come home to Meridian in a pretty wealthy community, and I would just listen to people complaining about everything. and how they had to go see their psychiatrist and why they were depressed about this. And I just look at these two things and go, what is happening here? People who have everything seem to be far more unhappy than those who have nothing, at least nothing in the terms that we tend to measure things by. And it was amazing to me the resilience of those people. Everybody was burying relatives. And here, that would be a long, long mourning, whatever. There, they didn't have time for that. They had to eat, they had to take care of somebody. And so you would have a mourning kind of period for a day or two. And sometimes they would even, if they had the money, hire people to weep and wail. And then it was over. And then they had to go back to work to take care of things, to feed their kids, to feed their grandkids. And I thought, you know, human beings are incredibly resilient if we let ourselves be.
That's an incredible perspective to have because as you were talking about that, I always think about even where I live, I see people complain about how expensive housing is and how there's not enough money bringing in with a job, and there's all these things that get complained about in our culture in America. And to realize that went to a third world country like Zimbabwe where life is much, much harder than we have it here, and to hear the drastic change that people are not so caught up and connected in those disappointments there that we are here because they don't have a choice other than to figure out how to do the basics of life, such as just eating and surviving. I find that fascinating.
You know, I've obviously thought a lot about that given the experiences I've had. And it's almost like if people don't have survival things that they have to deal with, they come up with things to cause themselves problems. And when all of your energy is spent on survival, you don't have time for all that other stuff. And maybe it's because life has gone so fast that we haven't been able to adapt to all the changes, that we haven't yet learned how to deal with it. But I think we have great lessons to learn from some of the cultures who we tend to view as being backward.
I couldn't agree more with you about that, Steve, because the thing in my head that I'm trying to rationalize right now is that in Africa, HIV was and still is a problem in that society on a disease end of things. And they don't have all the fancy equipment we have in the United States. They don't have access to all the medical treatments and all the things we offer here as easily and readily available. Um, and so the thing that stuck in my mind that you were talking about is that these people are happier than us. That's what's standing out in my head is they found some sort of gratitude or some sort of happiness, even in the midst of not having everything that we do. And so it makes me question, do they even have a level of grief in their life, or do they just make the most out of everything they come across?
Well, I think they do have grief. You know, everybody is grieving when you lose a child or you lose your mother or something like that. Um, I think one of the differences is in our society, we have come to believe, uh, not accurately, but we have come to believe that we can control things. And so we get
Mm.
incredibly upset when something happens, like a death or a financial disaster that we can't control. And we're kind of surprised by it. And we take offense that that happens. Whereas in Africa, death is just a part of life. And yes, feel sad, but that's what happens. And you move on. And I'm not so sure that something in there isn't more healthy, where we tend to see death as an offense. Somebody struck against me, and I'm angry because I couldn't control it. They don't have that privilege.
That's what I find fascinating, and I'm really glad you brought that perspective to the table today because in my coaching practice, I studied Stoicism a lot when I did personal coaching, and there's this idealism in Stoicism that when you focus on what you can't control, you'll always be disappointed, you'll always be upset by something, you'll always be let down, or you'll feel that something's a real struggle or a real negative in your life. And when you start to make this shift from what you can't control to what you can control, it's almost like you let go of those things that you can't control. You just accept them for what they are. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you don't have feelings or emotions towards those things, such as when somebody passes. That is hurtful in a lot of ways, and we emotionally have to work how to process that. But we almost don't take it on personally from that perspective. We accept it as part of life, like you said, the culture in Africa portrays.
Yeah. I've always been an admirer of Viktor Frankl and,
Mm.
Man's Search for Meaning. And probably the worst situation that any of us could possibly imagine, torture, death, murder, everything going on, and you have zero control. He found a way to control his life, to deal with it, and to teach others how to do that. And miraculously, he survived the concentration camps and spent much of the rest of his life trying to teach people how to do that, how to deal with what they could control and take their satisfaction and their pride and their awareness from what they could control, no matter how little that was.
You know, you're the first person I've talked to that's read that book and understands it, and I appreciate that. Uh, that book made me cry in a lot of ways when I read that because I
Oh,
couldn't believe the atrocity that people who haven't read that book, my listeners that haven't read Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, I highly recommend reading that book. Viktor Frankl didn't have to go to Auschwitz. That's the funny part. He didn't have to. He chose to go to Auschwitz with his family, and so that in its own twist up front in the book was really mind blowing when you talk about what you can and can't control.
and
He,
lost his family while there.
yes, and Steve, I don't know if you remember the end of that book, but it was really fascinating when they Auschwitz got liberated. I remember Victor talking about how there were some internment camp prisoners that were set free, and they went to the villages nearby Auschwitz and started vandalizing and destroying things and really lashing out because of what they experienced. And he also talked about, though, there were internment camp people that were set free that did the complete opposite. They actually just went out there and said, I'm grateful that I'm free. I have my freedom back. I have my choice of life back. I get to start again. And he just talked about the polarizing beauty of that that we're talking about today.
My wife and I were talking about that a little bit just last night because we were looking at some other books. So I go back in, and most of my books I've given away in Africa or someplace because people needed them more. But I've always saved a few. And I first read Man's Search for Meaning in high school, and it
Oh.
just blew me away and really started changing the way I thought about the world and I thought about myself. And it's an amazing man, amazing book.
It really is. It was a real testament in that book to what grief can be for us and how we can move through grief. Because the biggest thing I saw through that book is that we don't always get over something and let go and move on. We don't always do that, but we find a way to move through those experiences. And I think that, one of my biggest takeaways I took from his book was learning exactly what you shared is that they learned how to make the best of what they had, even when it was so minimal. And that minimalness was just having a piece of bread that day. I mean, that's literally the minimal amount of freedom they had was that. Or if somebody had died in that camp, I mean, I remember hearing the stories in that book of them taking shoes or taking clothes or taking a belonging or something like that. And I was really shocked and surprised when I read that book. It sounded so gruesome and in a lot of ways like it is like, oh my God, how would you do this kind of thing? But then you get into the mind of where they're at and their suffering and their grief and loss of their life in all aspects, and you realize that that was a real sense of not having control in life and not having an ability to dictate your outcome. You never knew if you were going to live the next day or not. And so taking those
Yep.
little things that came to you was really giving them hope and giving them the ability to move forward, even in the worst environment.
And, I think it's a study not just of the tragedy that happened in the concentration camps, but we do that in a microwave all the time. Sometimes we get so focused on the past that we can't move forward. Uh, we are blaming ourselves for things. We are feeling bad about things. We are get into depressions and angry, and we get stuck. On the other side, sometimes we're so living in the future and what's going to happen here, that we forget our family, we forget our friends, and it's hard to live in the present. And I think Frankl was able to do that to a large degree, to live in the present. And I don't do that enough. I tend to be the futurist. You know, I'm looking at what could be, what we could make happen. And I've had to work on how do I live more in the present and enjoy family and friends and going outside and things like that, and not be totally focused on the future. So I think we can err either way. And I shouldn't say err, because that's part of being human, is suffering and repentance and putting things away. It's also human to be looking forward to what comes next. But if we go too far either way, we forget about now.
That couldn't be more well said. And you're reminding me of another book I read that was really powerful by Eckhart Tolle, the Power of Now. And he talks a lot about that book, exactly what you just brought up, that when we're living too far on the spectrums, we miss everything that's happening right in front of us. And so, I do know that when I talk to people going through grief, we do tend to cling to our grief a lot in many ways. And I think that happens a lot in American culture up front. Death becomes something that we have a hard time accepting. And I think it's the way that it's approached in our society because, I witnessed it firsthand that, a funeral home, people come by, they pick up the body, it's in a bag and boom, it's gone. And the next time you see it is at a funeral in a casket. And then that's in the ground and you're, meeting with your friends and family and having a celebration of life, and that's it. And so I think that because there's so much mystery we shroud around it of what that actually means, and we don't give ourselves space to process and understand our emotions or what this might mean for us, that's where we start like pulling on those extremes of the past or the future really hard, and we don't just stay present in that moment, like you were talking about.
Yeah, it's hard
It
uh,
is.
to stay in the moment. And, I have to force myself to do that sometimes because I'm either ahead or behind. But there are people right here who need me. There are people right here who I can have fun with and get great joy from and share things with. And, that's what I'm trying to do a little bit now, is teach other people how to share the parts of life that can make a difference for somebody else, not just say, well, that's past, I'm leaving it.
And the thing I love about you, by the way, is we connected over sailing when we first talked. And I love that I met a fellow sailor, by the way. It just is a happy place for me to meet somebody else in that realm. And you talked a lot about teaching your grandkids, if I remember right, how to sail in the Caribbean, if I remember right.
Yeah,
Um,
we were in Belize.
Belize, that's it. And I think that's a beautiful example of what you were just talking about is being able to go out on a boat in particular. I've tried to share this with people because when I go out on my own boat, they say, well, why don't you post pictures? Why don't you post videos on social media? And I go, because I'm not thinking about you guys when I'm out there. I'm fully dialed into the present moment. I'm watching seals and whales and whatever else is flying around out there, or I'm waving to another boater, or we're talking and chatting the breeze, or we're heeled over like this and just cruising along. And being in that present moment, there's just so much to be said when you take away that future, you take away the past, and you're just right there. There's this clarity that overcomes you. And I think that you described that really well when you told me about taking your grandkids sailing. And I thought that was such a beautiful moment. And I was envisioning you guys having fun down there in Belize in the blue water, just having a great time.
Well, we were. Let me share a little bit about that. But you just reminded me of something. When our first children, we would go to Disneyland or someplace like that, and I was trying to record everything. And VCRs were about like this big then, and you have to put them on your shoulder. And I was running ahead trying to record, trying to do this, And as we had more kids, I threw that thing away. I said, I don't care about that. I want to enjoy Disneyland with the kids. I don't want to be out there somewhere trying to record the thing. And so we don't have that much video of our older kids because I started doing things with them instead of trying to record it for who knows, probably nobody will ever look at it anyway. Uh, but back to Belize. I think one of the things probably that we share as sailors is when you're sailing, you're forced to pay attention to the presence because you've got to get the wind right. You've got to get the sail set right. You've got to make sure your navigation is right. You've got to, and it forces you to do that. And that's part of the joy, I think, of it, because you're trying to, get all the wind you can, make sure you come in at the right place. We were sailing, this was in Belize again. This was just with some guys a long time ago, and we've been practicing navigation. Turned out it was just cloudy the whole time, and fog came in. We couldn't see much. And when we arrived where we were supposed to at the next island, boy, there was joy like crazy because we did it. We're here where we're supposed to be. We made it. And, with the grandkids, just seeing them, feel the wind, experience the sunshine. And we actually did have dolphins on either side of the bow going with us. And, their eyes would get big and they'd look at that and just follow those dolphins. And when we get out in nature, I think we're forced to deal with the presence and we find joy in that. That's part of why it's so much fun.
I couldn't agree more. And I think what's interesting about sailing, by the way, is that we can't control Mother Nature. We can't control if it's going to be 5 knots of breeze or 25. We're not going to control, if it's cloudy or sunny out. We're not going to control if it's a calm sea state or 10-foot swell out there. We can't control those things. But we've got to be so present to control the boat, adjusting sails and, making sure the boat's not overpowered and things like that. So it puts you in that
Exactly.
place where you just can't focus on 10,000 things at once. You got to be right there in the moment.
Most of the sports that I have done have not been team sports because when I was growing up, I couldn't see until I got glasses in the sixth grade. So I was always the last one chosen because I couldn't catch a ball unless it hit me. And, but I could read. And that reading brought me enormous joy in going through things. And I could go do individual things. So started camping and hiking and climbing and sailing. And I think things like that just bring us so much joy. I have a good friend who just lost his wife of some 55 years and had after a long, horrible death. And now he's rattling around in this big house all by himself. And it's hard to get out of that. So we have a trip planned to Patagonia in October. He's just had a back operation. He's hoping he can get ready for that. But now he's got something to look forward to, something to plan for. Every day he can go for a walk so he can get in shape to go to Patagonia and go trekking. And I think nature kind of forces us to get back to things that are most important.
I'm really glad you brought that up. And first off, I just want to say I'm very sorry for your friend's loss of his spouse of 55 years. That's a rough loss to go through. But I love that you're there to help him and take him on a trip like that to Patagonia. I just think that having something to look forward to and let alone going out into nature, I think is one of the best healing modalities out there of everything you could possibly do. Um, you know, I,
Uh,
I watch a show on History Channel called Alone, and it's where they drop 10 people out in the wilderness and they don't have food or water or any of that. They have to fend for that themselves. And I've always told people if they've never watched the show, this show is all about mindset, believe it or not, and less about skill. Because these guys get pushed to the absolute limits of what their tolerance is. And one of the guys I watched was always talking about how much he didn't like his job and getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning. And He had a mental breakdown on day 40, 42. He literally cried and screamed to God. I mean, it was like really kind of hit you watching this thing. And he said in a later season when he came back, he said that was one of the most transformative experiences of my life because after that breakdown I had, I started realizing I wanted to spend more time with my wife. I wanted to spend more time with my kids. This job I didn't like wasn't important. He said I started figuring out that all these things I was paying attention to weren't providing value to my life. They were taking it away. And he changed his whole life just by going into nature in that capacity.
You know, you mentioned that when we first talked, and I'd never seen that. So I got up the series on Patagonia and
Oh,
watched the whole first season of Patagonia, and was struck by a number of things, just like you were. One was I didn't like very much. I'm watching these people starving to death, and because they didn't have food and getting weaker and weaker. But most of them, it wasn't the food, it was the loneliness. It was missing their family. It was missing their friends, and how they were all making these vows that to themselves that when this was over, win or lose, they were going to spend time with their kids and their wife and nature and enjoy life. And I think it's just like the Zimbabweans with AIDS. They have to move on. They can't just deal with all of that. And these guys who went off to Patagonia alone, they had to deal with the things that were most important.
well, I think, bringing that back to your time in Africa, I mean, I can get it and understand it after watching that show that you just don't have time to grieve the way we do in America. I mean, in most ways in our culture, you could grieve for 3 or 6 months and not really have to work much. You could get all sorts of resources, all sorts of support for mental health, all those things. But in a third world country like Zimbabwe, where survival is becoming priority over all those other things going on, you almost don't have a choice to sit there and stay in that place because of your
Uh,
survival. You have to move forward because of your circumstance.
well, it's true. And, you know, I think uh, because we are so affluent, we sometimes look at Africa and Africans and say, well, they must, be different. Uh, Things are bad over there, but they have to handle it. That's just their life. And they're different than we are. They're not. They have all the same hopes and dreams and fears and concerns and loves and intelligence that any of us do. But they have different circumstances. And they have to learn to live with that, and they do. And if, as our circumstances change, like they did during the Great Depression, or like they did during World War II, and now they're having to change because of the rapid pace of invention and of knowledge, and we haven't learned how to deal with that yet, but we will. It gets back to resilience, I think. Every generation faces its own problems, its own issues. They make their own mistakes, but eventually they figure it out. Sometimes there's huge costs to figuring out, like a war or like losing families or whatever it is. But eventually we figure it out. I think we're headed into another one with AI. Everybody's kind of excited about it, terrified of it. It's going to happen anyway. And we are going to make thousands of mistakes and make huge errors. But eventually we'll figure it out. We'll figure out how to manage it. I guess I just have that kind of faith in the next generation.
Well, it's interesting that you bring that up because I'm a big history buff. I love history, especially reading up about our country, where it even started and where we're at today. Um, and we as a country, we've made a lot of mistakes, colossal ones, by the way. And when you look at it though, from this perspective of the following, if you grew up in the 30s like my grandfather did, when you grew up during the Dust Bowl, when there was a massive depression in the economy and people didn't have jobs, people didn't have you couldn't go to Walmart and buy everything and anything you wanted. That just didn't exist. And the city had to hunt for food. Funny story, where he lived in North Dakota. So when you look at where he grew up in, there was a lot of scarcity, there was a lot of survival there. There was not a lot of thriving. But then when
Yeah.
you look at somebody that, went through the 50s, for example, the 50s was a thriving decade in America economy. Everybody had nice cars, nice houses, jobs were prevalent. And then we went through lots of revolutions. The 60s went through its thing, the 70s went through it, so on and so forth. Every decade, like you said, had problems, had mistakes, but then there were things that we learned from. And so I look at it collectively in the capacity that you just spoke about, that we're going to make mistakes. It's not going to be perfect. We're not going to get it figured out on strike one. It's just not going to happen. But we have to have faith that it's through this ability to learn and grow and evolve and adapt to our circumstances. Like you talked about Viktor Frankl, he was big about adapting to circumstances when you read through that book. I think that's ultimately where our society will continue to stay. And I love your faith that you have towards us on that one.
the one of the things that humans are not very good at, I think, is perspective. Um, when they were having the Black Lives Matters march, I was listening to people talk about the country's going to hell, everything's falling apart. We've never had anything. I'm thinking, where were you in the 60s and 70s? We were burning down cities. We were taking over universities. And if they're at all a student of American history, as you are, we have always been a contentious society from the very beginning. We fought a Revolutionary War of that. We fought a Civil War over that. We've fought two world wars over that. We and we have complained and whined and gotten angry at everything all the way along. We've also been the first adapters, the people who would take whatever technology it is, whatever new societal thing it is, and we go for it 100% and make mistakes and fall apart with that. But eventually we figure it out. We find a way forward.
And I think that brings me back to another word you brought up that I heard yesterday a lot too, is resilience. And I think that a lot of times our grief journeys make us resilient. And I think resiliency turns us into who we eventually need to become. It puts us on this path to discover ultimately where we're supposed to go going forward and how to do that.
I think you're absolutely right. Another author that you've probably gone through that I've always liked is Eric Erickson. He's a psychiatrist. He's written books like Gandhi's Truth and Young Man Luther. And what he looks at and is often out of our greatest perceived weaknesses come our greatest strengths and our greatest contributions to society. Gandhi, who was a bit nuts, managed to turn that into a peaceful revolution and a change of the way people viewed things. Luther, out of his fear of what was going on, started a revolution in religion that changed things. Not that he set out to do that, but because he was drawing from his own fears, his own concerns, his own weaknesses, and that turned into the greatest strengths. And I think that's really often true for many of us. My weakness, as I mentioned, was I couldn't play ball. Didn't get called on teams because I couldn't see, but I could read, and that changed my life. I remember one of the books I read in just probably grade school was about uh, not Einstein, about people who would take everything away. Dr. Schweitzer, who gives up everything he has and goes to Africa to start a clinic. And that grabbed me. And I think had I never read that book, I never would have ended up in Africa. I never would have ended up doing those things because I just viewed myself as a potato farmer from Idaho, but and who couldn't see. But I was able to turn that lack of being able to see and play sports into reading, which changed my life.
I'm gonna be honest with you. I think in today's world, reading has become undervalued in so many ways, and I feel very sad about that personally because I may not have traveled internationally, I may not have had a lot of experiences other people have had, but I've read so many books about people that have, and to your point, I really see reading as eyes into somebody else's journeys and travels and lessons they've learned and experiences they've had. And I think that it really opens your mind up to a whole different perspective. Another word he brought up today, perspective. Um, some people, look at the world and say it's complete crap and this sucks. Another person says this is an opportunity for change and growth. And
Yeah.
so, who's to say who's right and wrong in that moment, by the way? I mean, one person might be right, another one might be right at a certain point, but there is always that place to move forward. And I think that's where, when we do make mistakes, and we're going to make mistakes all the time, but it's the way we learn, it's through that and not to avoid it. And I think that's the power of reading a book. Like you said, we've been a contentious society, and I've kind of laughed too in the last 5 years when I hear people get very rowdy about politics and societal things going on. I say, guys, this happened in the 60s, it happened in the 70s, it happened in the 80s, it happened in the 90s. I said, it's happened all the damn time. I'm like, this isn't some brand new concept for America. It's not.
It's who we
It's
are.
it's who we are. So,
Yeah. I'm just looking there at all your books back there, and you can kind of tell what's important. And I agree with you. I think we don't read enough. Um, if I could segue just a little bit, I mentioned that my latest adventure has been writing this book. And I'm writing it in part to try to pass along to my grandchildren and and maybe great great grandchildren who I'll never know, the things that I feel have been important in life, the principles, traits. And I'm trying to, in the process of the book, teach other people my age to tell stories and pass that along to their grandkids and great grandkids. Because I think kids today are inundated with data. They get it from social media, from the internet. Now they're starting to get it from AI. But what do you do with it? And here's all these bits and data pieces. But I think stories passed by a grandfather or great grandfather onto their grandchildren helps provide that perspective and context and humanity, even though the world they live in is very different from the world I lived in. And we've lost our ability to do that. And I think kids today, more than ever, need that connection to the past, to their relatives, to their stories, to the things that happened with them. I've had a great, 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 I don't know how many greats here, grandfather who in England, who was apprenticed to his uncle, who was a baker. And he joined a church that the uncle didn't like. He had a girlfriend the uncle didn't like. And so finally, this guy escaped, still a teenager, away from his uncle, got to a boat, came across that boat, got married on the boat, got his girlfriend with him, and gets to New York and then has to figure out how to get across the continent to where he wanted to be. And I think, since then, there's been a civil war, 2 world wars, a Great Depression, and now this explosion. And his world is very different than mine. But I would love to know, what was he thinking? What was he feeling? What made him do that? What was he afraid of? What was it like when he gets to New York with nothing and he knows he's got to get across the continent? What was it, or what were his concerns about his new wife? And I think if I had had those things, they would have given me more perspective, even though my problems are very different. And I think if we can provide those kind of same stories to our great grandchildren, who knows? Maybe 20 years from now, when I'm long gone, a great great grandchild who maybe is feeling lost or depressed or unsure of themselves or don't know where to turn will read that and say, you know what? That was my great great granddad. And he went through this and he saw that this was important and he made that human. And I'm proud of that. And while my world is very different than his, I can draw from that. I'm part of that. I'm part of that wisdom. And maybe that story will just help them find the light or the revelation or the information that they need to take a bad situation and make it better.
That is beautifully said, Steve. I couldn't agree more with you on that. I think that today we've got people that are attention spans of about 3 seconds. So if they don't get everything they want in 3 seconds, they're on to the next thing. And that's where we've got a disconnect in society. And that's where I really appreciate you segueing to your books. That's where I was going to take things next, is that I love your ability and desire, by the way, to keep storytelling a part of your life and a part of this book, getting people to understand how important storytelling is. You made me reflect, by the way. I had an uncle who was in Pearl Harbor the day it got bombed, and I never asked him growing up because I was fearful of asking that question for some reason. I got to ask it for him 2 years before he died, and I said, you know, Uncle Larry, I said, what was it like in Pearl Harbor that day? I said, I've read the history books, I've watched the videos, but what was it like in person? Because those are very different perspectives. And he told me, he said, I was actually going off the ship for shore leave to go play football in the morning. And we opened up the door to the ship, the big watertight door. We step out on deck, and he said, you would see nothing but smoke and fire and bombs and screams and blood all over the place. He said it was an absolute, you couldn't even picture it. He said it was just absolutely awful. And he went on a long story I can share on another podcast, but that perspective of storytelling that you're talking about, his story he shared with me was so powerful because it put into perspective what I've read about or what I've watched a movie about, but it put it in real terms for me to say, wow, I know somebody that went through that, experienced it firsthand. And wow, that just, you know, it makes you kind of feel like you said in a little bit of a way that my problems aren't as bad as I think they are. Or maybe there's a different perspective I can have on my life going forward.
And his life is a part of yours. You can connect to that because hey, that's a that's somebody I know, that's somebody I feel about, I care about. Um, if we got time, I could tell just one little story that kind of helped me
Mhm.
write the book. I was telling stories just at bedtime to a grandson who was 7, and I happened to be telling him about his uncles who he dearly loves, who are my youngest sons, who are Black. And I was telling him about when they were in high school, they would periodically be followed home by the police because of their skin color. And this grandson looks at me and says, Grandpa, that's dumb. Why would they do that? Well, that's not an easy thing to explain to a 7-year-old. And if I had told that 7-year-old that I was going to give him a lecture on prejudice and discrimination, wouldn't have gone anywhere. But he didn't want to let it go. And we had a long conversation. And the next morning he brought it up again. Why? Because now to him it was real. It was his uncles. It was his grandfather telling the story. And he wanted to know. And it was part of him. And so I suspect that that will change the way he views things through the rest of his life. But it happened because of a story, just like you changed your view of things because of your uncle's story who opened that door at Pearl Harbor. It changes you.
I I love the way you just described that. That's what I've been trying to figure out with storytelling for a long time. I think that is really the gateway to creating an emotional connection of things and in a way grounding that process in your head because instead of just reading something on social media and saying, oh, okay, that was interesting, I read that. When you actually have a deep conversation like you had with your grandson to talk about racial prejudice that was going on with your sons growing up. I mean, to have that deep level conversation and hear it from you and not somewhere else out there on social media, internet, or some other, you know, third context, if you will, but to hear it directly from you, I know he's going to remember that because I remember that with my grandfather with certain things 25 years ago. I think he's going to remember that story for his life. And that's the
Yeah.
true beauty of what your book and who you are as a person. That's a beautiful gift to give your children.
And it's a gift I think all of us can, if we will. But so often people think, well, I don't have anything to say, or I don't have any sources, and you do. Everybody has stories. Everybody has things that are important to them. But we get busy with sports and food and movies that we don't pass on those things that I think people are desperately looking for. They're looking for the humanity. They're looking for the perspective. They're looking for the context that makes all this data mean something. And it helps their lives mean something when they can connect with that. And I think they're losing a lot of that today.
I think we are because, I hate to date myself a little bit, but I grew up without smartphones, without social media, our computers. You might have played Minesweeper on it if you were lucky enough to figure out how to do that. We had dial-up internet that you may or may not connect at a certain point. So we didn't have all this information excess that we see today. I had to rely on books and the card catalog at the library, that big thing to pull out and go through cards. And
Yeah.
yeah, people younger than me are gonna look at me weird, go, I don't even know what that is. But we didn't have that information influx. So I think storytelling was very prevalent back then. I still remember going camping and they always would have a park ranger share a story at night for all the kids in the campground. I don't know if they do that today, but I remember it vividly. Um, and you would talk to your grandparents, you'd talk to your parents, you'd talk to a neighbor, you'd talk to a friend. We didn't have all this massive, pick up a smartphone and you can find out anything and everything you want about whatever topic known to man. And I think that the storytelling is a big part of our history and our legacy as humanity. I mean, all the way back to, the kings and queens of England back in 1200. Storytelling is what's carried us through the centuries that we've lived through. And so I think that it's something to hang on to that's very important. That's what I wanted to say about that.
You're right. And even further back, we all have seen the pictures of the caves in France where the early humans had painted pictures on the wall of the hunt and the hunter, in part because that was part of their survival, but in part to share them to the next generations. And storytelling has been a part of our lives forever up until recently. And now, yeah, we tell quick stories, but we often lose that humanity in it. And we have a very, very valuable gift to pass on if we can convince ourselves that we can and then do it.
Well, Steve, I appreciate you coming on today and inspiring my audience and people who are going to listen to this to embrace storytelling and get away from that high speed big data thing for a second and jump into storytelling for a minute. Open yourself up to sharing your perspective. Share your story of something you went through or something you experienced or something that your grandparent or maybe your father told you or your great grandparent in some cases. Share those stories, let them out because there's a lot of value as you brought today on the podcast to say that it's our humanity and our human connection through storytelling that allows us to gain a very powerful perspective in our life, not just in the present moment, but something we can carry forward.
Yeah, it's how we deal with life. That's how we deal with grieving, as the stories that we're able to share with each other, so we don't have to do it alone. In some ways, it's kind of strange, but all the data, in some ways, just isolates us even more. And we have to learn how to connect that to something, just like we do when we're grieving. If we just are all by ourselves, it's hard. But if we can connect to other people around us who love us and care for us and have been through similar experiences, that gets us through it.
That is beautifully said, my friend. I couldn't agree more with you about that. And that's why I think today a lot of people do feel isolated. I think more than people wanted want to admit. And I think it's because we're so glued to our phones that we forgot about the people around us. And so I appreciate you saying what you just did there. I wanted to ask you a big question as we end the podcast here. What's one big bit of advice, or maybe two bits of advice, you would want to share with us from your storytelling in your life that would impact other people and help them not feel so alone.
I think as I started trying to put this book together, I had to identify, well, what are the traits and beliefs and principles that have been important to me? Well, that takes some work. When I'm like most people, I hate writing, but I love having written because writing forces you to think and to clarify. And in doing that, I did identify things that I think are worth passing on. And I think too often people think that, well, I haven't really experienced anything or I don't have any stories. And so they don't. Um, but I guess the one thing I try to pass on always to the younger generation, but even to my own age, is we all have dreams, we all have hopes, and too often we don't take any action on those. We just let them sit there. And we all want to make a difference in somebody's life. We all want to make a difference to the world and the society, but we're too often afraid to do anything. And I guess my piece of advice is dream your dreams, believe in yourself, and start taking, even if it's just tiny steps toward making it happen.
I love that, Steve, because that's where I'm at in my life currently, and it's why I have this podcast, is I'm taking steps towards my dreams and I'm taking steps towards creating a legacy and a foundation that helps and serves other people. And I think that in a lot of ways, life, especially in America, we kind of fall into societal norms. We fall into what everybody tells us to do or what we should be or how we should think. And we don't
Yeah.
ever take that time to stop and say, well, I have a story. I have a life. I have an experience. I've learned things. I had this happen to me, or this is something I learned when I went through X experience. And I love that you're encouraging people to share that because I think at the end of the day, the word that stuck through me as you were talking today is that's our humanity. That's what brings us together. And that's a beautiful gift that we all have.
It is. Some 40 years ago, I was on a march for equality from the train station in Boise, Idaho, down to the Capitol. And when we got down there, um, it was kind of a cold, starting to rain, and it was getting evening, so it was getting dark. And I was supposed to give a speech. Well, there had been all kinds of speeches on big, important values and concepts and preamble to the Constitution, and we need to all do this and write our congressman. I said, what do I say? And what I ended up saying was, I don't expect everybody to go start a march or to start a revolution or write their congressman. But if we could all just, next time we see somebody who maybe is a different color or a different religion or a different socioeconomic class, instead of turning around and walking away, just go over and say, hi, here's who I am. I'd like to get to meet you. Something as simple as that, if we could all do that, I think would do more than all the laws that come down from Washington or anywhere else. And it's the same with making a difference. If we all just take the little step, that's what makes things happen.
I you are a wisdom knowledge person today, Steve. I love what you just said there because that's what I talk about when I'm a guest on podcasts. That in a lot of ways, what you just said is what I preach a lot. I say grief doesn't discriminate. It doesn't care what color your skin is, what orientation you happen to be, where you live, where you're from. It doesn't care. And so that small step that you just talked about is where I lead people to acceptance. And that acceptance piece begins with that phrase, hi, how are you? Or hi, I'd love to get to know you. And
Yeah.
not going into that with preconceived notions or what you've been wired to think and believe, but just seeing that person just exactly who they are without preconceived notion, but just this is another person walking this journey just like I am. And they're doing it a little differently than me, and that's okay. Nothing wrong with that. But I might have something to learn from them. They might even share something I didn't know or not aware of. and they might actually help me on this journey just like I can do for them. And it all starts with hi, like you said.
Hey, how are you? Yeah, yeah, great.
That's beautiful, Steve. Before we end the podcast, I wanted to ask, where can we find your book?
Thank you. The book is called Stories That Shape Us, a guide to passing on wisdom, love, and joy to the next generation. And you can find it on Amazon. And it's there. The e-copy is there, and we'll have an audiobook soon. And but I would like people to know that I'd like them to get the paperback because it's a workbook. And as they go through it, I want them to write down what they're thinking, or write down what they're feeling, write down what they want to do. And that makes it far more valuable than just listening to stories. The stories are fun. They're pretty funny, I think, as people go through it. My own grandkids say, "Oh, Grandpa, you were pretty dumb," and but they love the stories. But more important for the book is to try to teach people how to come up and tell their own stories and pass that on. So yeah, they can find it there. They can find more about it at my website, which is just Steve-Mann, STEVE-MANN.com. And there they can find lists of podcasts like this, or they can find information about the book or more about me if they want to know more about me.
Well, Steve, I appreciate you sharing that. And for listeners today who are listening to the podcast episode, you guys will find Steve's website and link to his book below in the show notes. So make sure you guys look for that after you get done listening to this episode. Steve, again, I want to thank you so much for coming on the show. And it's truly been an honor, my friend, to meet you on this journey of mine. I'm really glad we got to connect, and I really look forward to staying in touch with you.
Hey, it's been great fun for me too, Chris. Keep sailing.
Yes. Well, I want to thank all of our listeners today for joining Steve and I on this episode of the Empower Grief Journey podcast. If this episode resonated with you, please share it with somebody you know who could benefit from Steve's story. For more episodes that are designed to empower you and support you during your grief journey, visit empowergriefjourney.com and subscribe to this podcast. You can find us on Apple and Spotify. The Empower Grief Journey is all about honoring your journey, embracing your emotions, and finding strength in your own time. I want you to know that you're never alone on this journey, and together we can navigate grief with courage and compassion. Until next time, be kind to yourself and take your grief journey one step at a time.